Good morning. This is Core Services in our Core Belief Series, Why It Matters. Today we're going to be discussing budgeting basics. Yes, it is that time of year where associations are starting to plan for their next fiscal year, especially those that are starting January 1st. So thought we would help you with some of the do's and don'ts and some planning ideas on the budget as you head into that. I'm John Coggle and I am today's presenter. Little bit about Core Services before we get going. Core is focused on audit and review services in Oregon and Washington. We focus almost exclusively on condos and HOAs. But we also do other commercial entities when it comes to their attest services. We also offer advisory services to help boards with their decision making. We can help with board meetings, vote supervision where necessary, and also with those, evaluating and coming up with a good budget for that next year. So as we get going, a couple of things that we'd want to think about is the budget dues. Always evaluate the last couple of years when you get ready to start your budget cycle. It isn't just looking at the prior year. You really do want to take a look at it over a couple of years, 2-3 years, to make sure you're going to identifying any potential trends that are out there. Have you been budgeting low and it's always been high? Have you been budgeting for something you've never spent money on? Sometimes that can get overlooked by just looking at that prior year. So take a good couple of years in there and make sure you're comfortable with where things have been going. Always focus on separating the operating fund from the reserve fund. The reserve fund is driven by that reserve study, so you really don't need to focus too much on it in this as part of this your first budget run. Really think about what you want to spend money on an operating basis for your next year's operations. Also, make sure you have a good idea of what new expenses may be coming up. You might be needing to cut down some trees, and that wasn't part of your reserve studies, so you're going to have to pay for that out of the current operating budget. So be thinking about what else you may need to be spending. And then along with that, ask what kind of expenses you might be able to cut from the current year's operating budget. If almost all of your owners have turned over their email address, you might be able to avoid coming up with a printing expense, having to print the newsletter that gets sent out. Perhaps you can send it out by email or through SurveyMonkey or even have it on your Facebook page. Lots of ways to get that information out to the owners, and it doesn't necessarily have to go by paper and through the mail. Some budget don'ts when it comes to your operating budget. Don't just take your prior year without seriously evaluating what it meant. We see a lot of cases where they just roll it over year to year. They spend 20 minutes on the budget and they're done. That's probably not a healthy way to do it. Unfortunately, yes, you can get away with it for a while, but eventually something rears its ugly head and bites you in the butt. So don't just assume that the current year is going to be just like last year. And along with that, don't just assume it's going to be the whatever happened last year plus a factor for inflation. Some spending actually might be deflationary for you. There might be a glut of, say, qualified landscapers in your neighborhood, and they might be hungry for work. So, don't just assume whatever you spent last year plus some factor is the right number for this year. Always dig into your budget. Also, never start from the premise of trying to guess what the owners are going to pay. Yes, I know as a board you might hear complaints. They might come to you and say, "Oh, I'm barely getting by. You guys are the association is gouging me." Don't necessarily believe it. There's always an opportunity to rearrange personal finances. But if you try to limit what your association can do based upon what you think the overall ownership can pay, you may be missing opportunities to build the kind of community that actually everybody's really looking for. And then finally, don't forget to negotiate. because you're coming towards the end of the year, don't be afraid to go back to everybody, especially when you've been working them for a while, and put their work out to bid. Management companies, your auditor, the landscaper. If you have an ongoing contract with them and they've been doing it for 3 to 5 years, it's probably a good idea to put it out and make sure you're getting the appropriate value for it. Then there's also might be things you could get for the exact same price that your current management company is not offering you. So anyway, think about it. Those, negotiation can be a very, very important tool to keeping your budget under control. Make sure you always budget those reserve funds separately. The reserves budget is actually driven by your reserve study. And so if the reserve study has predicted that you have to spend money this year, your question is, does it really need to get spent this year, or can you actually defer it because it's in fairly decent shape? For instance, if you're an HOA and you have a fence going around, if you walk the fence and it's looking pretty good, your reserve study says it might be due to be replaced this year. If it's looking good and you don't have a lot of missing slats, you don't see a lot of dry rot or other rot going on, you might be able to push it off a year or two. That allows you to save a little bit of money, maybe add some more money to the reserve, and then obviously knowing that that's going to be coming up in a couple of years. But always be asking yourself, what do we really need to do, and make sure you have enough money to cover that in your current reserve fund. At the same time, don't ignore those things that are coming up 5, 6, 7 years from now. If you're looking at, especially for something very large, if you're looking at a major redo, so for instance, if you're behind a gate like I am, we have to do the streets. And the streets might cost $50,000 to reslurry and repave. If we're not thinking about that in the next 15 years, we could be getting down the road and all of a sudden be short by $25,000. Well, that could be a substantial amount of money for people to come up with. You want to talk about those, eliminating those complaints. That's a big opportunity right there. A few $100s a year now beats $1,000 in 5 years. Much easier for people to come up with it on that easy squeezy payment plan model. And then obviously, as you get going, don't be afraid to put everything out to bid. I don't care what kind of deal somebody thinks they can make you. Put it out to bid. Your landscaper might do a heck of a job, but just because he does a great job with the taking care of the grass doesn't mean he can put a fence up at an economical price for you. Finally, I've added an example budget, something to consider. You'll notice that it starts with the prior year's budget, and this one prior year is actual. And then that variance. Make sure you understand what really drove that variance, and if it's really going to pop up again. In this case, there was a special assessment receivable in that prior year, which is why that management additional work stepped up. It might be that that's not going to be an issue this year. So always be thinking about that. That's why I'm saying don't always take that prior year, because it may not be accurate. Always be thinking about where your biggest expenses lie. If it's in the landscaping and it's in the management, those are the areas where you need to focus, where your potential for negotiation. So, and always be looking at the additional work, not so much as their annual contract, but what is getting charged to you above and beyond that basic that you guys have already agreed to. I'm also a big fan of doing a contingency for each one of the various areas versus one great big contingency. This way you can kind of see if in this case management, you plan for total expenses of $21,000, it was $23,500, but $1,000 of that difference was obviously because you'd planned for things that might go wrong, all the way down. So, and then you'll notice that I always do it from the expenses first, and then we ask, based upon what the total expenses are, what do I need to have the owners pay? So what is that basic initial operating assessment? What is the potential for uncollectible owners that don't pay that we're not going to be able to get through lien and foreclosure if it goes to that? And if we want to add money into our safety net, our operating reserve, you can put a number in there. It tells you what that total assessment has to be. You can then compare that from your beginning cash. You can model out what your ending cash is going to be, and if that makes sense for you. So don't be afraid of really starting from that expense side and let it drive the conversation over what your assessments to the owners are. So anyway, hope this has been helpful. As always, feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. If you'd also like a copy of that spreadsheet, I can email it to you. Just go out to our website, core-acct.com, and shoot us a message. Hope you have a great day. We look forward to our next presentation with you.